Not only Kent, but I have to recognize you for braving the weather to come out this afternoon. And I'll remind you that our task force has several co-authors. I was merely the cat herder in chief, but in addition to the contributions of the other authors, we also have reviewers who contributed substantially to the final product that you hopefully have in your laps. So I'm going to give the executive summary, as it were, of our task force report, and hope that this conveys to you where we were coming from, starting with, first of all, well, here's our list of our members, and I'm sure you'll recognize many of the names on that list, and of course they are recognized in the document. The thing that we have to start with is, why do we regulate in the first place? What are the principles and objectives? And clearly, we want safe products. We don't want to have our society or our environment at risk from unsafe products, things that don't do what they're supposed to do, especially if they're going to be causing us some hazardous outcome. At the same time, we don't want to unduly stifle innovation. That's something we hear frequently, although safety is paramount. If something is unsafe, it doesn't matter how innovative it is. We're going to have to look very carefully at whether we can deploy that or not. Another one of the principles is that we have to regulate the features of products and not necessarily the process by which that product came about. If we're going to ask a regulatory safety question of some new innovative product, we need to have some scientific validation or justification to say, we want to grab that and take a look at it for safety purposes. We can't just, pull something out of the air that I know some people in our society would like us to do and say, this product, whether it's a disease-resistant strawberry or herbicide-tolerant corn, consumption of this may cause an increase in cancer in Peruvian marmots. Unless there's some kind of logical scientific connection showing that Peruvian marmots might be at risk from your eating these strawberries or corn, we don't want to go there. That is not appropriate use of our regulatory power. We want to regulate commensurate with the actual risk posed and recognize that we have history. So as we acquire more familiarity and experience with a given set of products with given traits associated with them, and we see what happens when they're put out into the environment, we know whether our regulatory scrutiny has been insufficient if a lot of unpleasant things occur, or perhaps too sufficient if nothing has happened. And unfortunately, in many cases, our current practice violates all of these principles and objectives. When it comes to ag biotech, we have a number of different terms, and this is part of where the confusion comes in. We can call it recombinant DNA, genetic engineering, the dreaded GMO, bioengineering, and perhaps the more benign term ag biotech. In public use, all of these terms mean essentially the same thing. Some of them do have more technical, precise definitions, but for the most part, when I'm speaking to the public will ask me questions and use any one of these terms to suggest, what it is that they're concerned about. There's a number of NGOs out there that I'm sure you're familiar with that come in with the mantra that genetic engineering as a process itself is unnatural and therefore unsafe, or even just unsafe, and therefore it should be very stringently regulated. They've been saying this now since the 1970s, when genetic engineering was in its infancy, and unfortunately they've had far too much influence in policy development, where the process of genetic engineering or the process of recombinant DNA has been the trigger for considering, this product emanating from that process may itself be hazardous in a way that we're not expecting. Here in the U.S., we have three primary agencies, the USDA, FDA, and EPA, under the umbrella from OSTP in the White House, and the coordinated framework. I don't need to get into that. Most of you probably know it better than I do. But at least recognizing that we do have a regulatory system in this country. It is a bureaucracy, of course, but it does seem to function. We recognize that. We do get products through the system, perhaps not as many as we'd like, perhaps not as quickly as we'd like, not as expeditiously, but the system does work. And that's important because some countries on this planet would dearly love to have more biotech crop and food products out there, but they can't because their systems do not. We also have a very strong scientific community. The National Academy of Sciences, through the National Research Council primarily, have been conducting studies on the safety of various aspects of agricultural biotechnology going back to the earliest days, in the 1980s, and the 1990s, and the 2000s, right up until, there was a seminal one last year, and even in 2016, and even last year in 2017. So the NRC and of the National Academy is keeping an eye on this, and as Kent mentioned, I was fortunate enough to serve on a couple of these, looking at different aspects. I was involved in the environmental aspects. What happens when you grow transgenic plants outdoors? Are they going to spread? Are they going to become invasive, noxious weeds, and so on? And I also served on another study looking at the food safety. And again, the initial question was, if we genetically modify a carrot, does that then turn that carrot or any food, carrot juice coming from that carrot, somehow carcinogenic? And at one point, that may have had some legitimacy. Before we had any experience with genetically modified foods and crops, you can see how people could have anxiety in addressing that question, and there was no actual experimental data showing whether it was or wasn't. The NRC studies invariably come to some general conclusions. One is that genetic engineering as a process presents no new risks. Right? So no additional risks over and above what we're already familiar with conventional breeding methods. It doesn't mean there are no risks at all, but it means that we can expect to see if there are hazards emanating and the risks associated with those. We're used to handling them because we're used to handling them in traditional breeding methods. Genetic engineering, another one of the general conclusions, is as safe as traditional breeding methods. And again, this doesn't mean it's absolutely safe. Nothing is absolutely safe, but it's no more hazardous than traditional breeding, which we know from long years of experience is not particularly hazardous to begin with. Very few products have had to have been recalled from the field, from commerce, because of safety issues. And also noting again and again that the products, when they have hazards, they're with the products regardless of the process used. So the process of genetic engineering here, recombinant DNA, does not inherently or invariably introduce new substances into foods that may be hazardous. Fortunately, here in 2018, we can say that we still have a perfect track record. We in the scientific and plant breeding community have a perfect track record that no genetically engineered plant has caused a documented case of harm. Now, you'll find lots of people who will challenge this statement, and they'll tell you to, just Google it, and you'll find lots of examples of people claiming harms from the consumption of the dreaded GMOs. And that's absolutely true. Go to Google and Google it, and you'll find lots of examples. What I'm saying here is that these are not verified or documented in the literature. Anybody can make claims, as we now know. So you're back on Google and you're looking at images and you say, just what do GMOs look like? And you'll come up with this kind of result. And this is where we get to play one of these things is not like the other, or like the others. And the typical kind of presentations that you see, particularly from political NGOs that are driving an agenda, it's not necessarily science-based, will be scary pictures when, in actuality, the one true genetically modified organism in this group of 4 is in the lower left. That's a sweet potato. Now, sweet potato has never been genetically engineered by humans. It was genetically engineered by Mother Nature thousands of years ago. And today, when we eat sweet potatoes, they contain bacterial genes and DNA segments arising from that original event that Mother Nature did thousands of years ago. No human was involved in that. So ordinary sweet potatoes are GMOs under virtually any definition, except the human involvement part, because there was no humans involved in the DNA transfer or the DNA modification of those sweet potatoes. And we eat them all the time, and no known ill effect on the general population. A very quick primer on what genetic engineering is. So I have a very simple diagram here. If we're looking for an innovation that will produce a major crop like corn and allow it to grow and thrive and produce in a water-restricted environment, we could start by going out to the desert and finding a plant that lives in that arid environment, analyzing the DNA of that plant that seems to be happy growing even though there's not a lot of moisture around, and see if we can find a gene somewhere in the genome of that plant that confers this ability, the drought resistance gene, as I've indicated here. And what we would try to do in this simple format is isolate or make a copy of that gene that seems to be responsible for the drought tolerance in this desert plant, and take that copy and put it into the DNA of the corn. Corn would not have this because corn needs a fair amount of water to produce. In genetic engineering, all we're doing is making copies of genes, putting them in places where they haven't existed previously, adding an additional gene. Now, corn, of course, has tens of thousands of genes in its genome already. We're adding one more, and lo and behold, when the sun comes out, we turn off the water, and the corn plant is happy because this gene is working in the corn plant as the same way that it did in that desert plant. Okay, that's the concept of genetic engineering. It can be obviously more complicated than that, but the general procedure and what we try to do to make a transplant is there. Some of the GE products we have on the market, and I'm going to go through these quickly because you guys, I'm sure, are familiar with them. The first one, human insulin, genetically engineered product. And of course, the unique thing about human insulin is that this is not a gene from a bacteria going into a plant. This is a gene from a human being going into a microbe. And then the microbe reading that human DNA and creating the insulin exactly as it's done in the human pancreas, illustrating the universality of DNA as the medium controlling our recipes. The proteins made from DNA coming from humans is not in any way different from DNA in any other organism. One you may not be as familiar with is chymosin. Something like 80% of our cheese is produced now with chymosin, so cheese is a GMO. We have flavor saver tomato. Everybody recognizes a flavor saver tomato. Unfortunately, it's not on the market anymore. It was only there for a couple of years, and now what's this, coming up to 20 years that it's been off. And consumers, ordinary citizens, man and woman on the street, if you ask them to name a GMO, the likelihood is they'll mention the flavor saver tomato. Lesser products, fire-resistant squash, papaya from Hawaii that saved the Hawaiian industry from the papaya ring spot virus, and a number of other things. But these are mostly purified substances that we get in our food, ultimately. Corn oil, soybean oil, canola oil, cottonseed oil. The sugar beet produces sugar. By the time we eat these things, there's no more DNA, there's no more protein. These are purified. So are you truly eating a GMO by the time you put a packet of sugar in your coffee? And then there's a multitude of other things, drugs, vitamins, additives, using this basic genetic engineering technology. Status of the U.S. crops. U.S. farmers love GMOs. Where they are allowed to grow GMOs, the GMOs are very successful. Over 90% of our corn farmers, cotton farmers, and soybean farmers are growing genetically engineered varieties of these crops. All of these have come from big companies, by the way. So farmers willingly choose genetically engineered crops, and they do it every year. So if it's not a question of marketing or sales, that these big companies send the sales force out into the Midwest and coerce farmers into growing one of their genetically engineered varieties. Farmers have to make that decision each year. And if they don't like a particular variety, whether it's genetically engineered or not, they won't grow it again. But year after year, over 90% of our farmers continue to grow them. So, I notice this interesting paradox that, many people will say that, yeah, I support American farmers. I really support American farmers, but we got to ban GMOs. There's something of a disconnect. And I like to ask people, well, why should we take away the one of the major tools that U.S. farmers really like, when there's no evidence of harm either to that farmer or to the environment or to the rest of us? I'll give you an illustration of what it looks like. I had the joy of being in Indiana a couple of years ago and went to a farm. The farmer was growing both the genetically engineered BT corn and the non-BT corn, and stripped a couple of ears off, and the showing me the difference between the BT corn and the non-BT corn. And I'm not sure if you can see the difference here, but there's the ear on the left seems perfectly healthy with no damage whatsoever. And the one on the right, if you get a close look at the picture, you can actually see there's still an earworm in there, causing a fair amount of damage. And there's also some fungal infestation in there as well, which means mycotoxins. And I'm not going to tell you which one is the BT. Figure that out. Some of the other products that have come through the system, I mentioned the GE papaya in Hawaii. We also have genetically engineered soybeans now with differences in oil profiles. So oils that have more healthy fatty acid compositions. Golden rice, everyone's heard of for years, still not on the market. It's getting close, but we've all heard that every year for the last X number of years as well. Increasing the beta carotene to try to fight vitamin A deficiency in poor families that subsist mostly on rice, which is largely deficient in vitamin A. More exciting, perhaps, more recent additions to the group, the Arctic apple and the innate potato, approved last year and just coming onto the market now, non-browning apples, potato. Small companies, or at least smaller than the ones that are producing the genetically engineered corn, cotton, soybean, and canola. And then a whole group of exciting new products coming through using new breeding techniques or gene editing techniques or non-GMO techniques. We call these cisgenics or RNA interference, using techniques like zinc finger, CRISPR-Cas9, a whole group of these things, somewhat different, but they all share common features. They don't necessarily involve transgenes. They don't necessarily take a gene from a desert plant or a bacterium and put it into a corn plant. There's no transfer necessary for many of these products. There's no question about a species barrier. Some people are very concerned that we scientists are violating Mother Nature's species barrier, ignorant of the fact that there's no such thing. It's a deeply held belief, and if you want to get into an argument with people over that, you're probably wasting your time. And similarly, there's no foreign DNA. And again, the concept of foreign DNA is common out there. We in the scientific community more and more recognize that DNA is DNA. We all share DNA, whether we're a human or a bacterium, and the DNA is the same stuff. So the concept of foreign DNA it's almost like an oxymoron to the scientific community. It is not to general consumers. These new breeding techniques may circumvent regulations entirely because by their very nature, they do not trigger the current regulatory system in certain cases. Now, not all cases, but you can use these tools to circumvent regulations. And I'm not sure that's something that we want to do either. I mean, there may well be hazardous or hazards that we haven't anticipated or even that we have, but we want somebody to take a look at those before they go out on the market to preserve our environment or our health or the health of our animals. What are the benefits? You know, consumers will often say there are no benefits to GMOs, so even if the risks are small, even if we take your word for it that they're not very risky, why should we take any risk at all? Well, when farmers are asked, and USDA does this and other organizations as well, they come back saying, we get increased yields, we get higher quality grain, typically because there's less insect damage or there's fewer weeds or other contaminants in the grain, and that means farmers get more money, right? That's an appeal. Farmers also say they decrease their chemical use and the costs of chemicals, that they end up with cleaner fields, fewer weeds and so on, that they have less tillage because they don't have to drive their tractors around the field tilling up the soil to kill weeds, because they have much better weed control than previously. And that means there's less topsoil loss from wind and rain erosion. They're not driving the tractor around the field, so that means they're not spending as much money on fuel, and that also contributes to environmental air pollution, cleanliness. And there are risks, as always. And with genetically engineered crops, really the only one that the industry, that the academic community is concerned about is you can misuse herbicide-tolerant crops, leading to resistant pests, right? Eventually the pests will overcome the chemical and it will nullify the utility of using that herbicide to control those weeds. So that's a management issue. It's not a true safety issue, but it is real. It is a risk that we have to address. Consumers also see benefits, things like, and things that they don't see and don't necessarily want to see. Reduction in mycotoxins in corn is one of the very earliest demonstrated features, right? With the BT corn, there's less insect damage, which means there's less fungal infection, and the fungus doesn't have a chance to produce the mycotoxins. So if you test a load of BT corn grain as opposed to non-BT corn grain, then you will tend to find less mycotoxin content. This is something that we do monitor for. Not all countries do. There's less pesticides. Consumers say, we don't like pesticides, don't understand them, but we don't like pesticides. And one of the selling features of GE crops to date is that they are grown with fewer pesticides, and the pesticides that are used are safer than the older pesticides that the farmers used to spray. There's no reduction in nutritional composition. Again, something you'll hear consumers will say, wheat today, corn today, it's not as nutritious as in my grandparents' day. There are various environmental benefits. The reduction in tillage, again, they don't necessarily see this directly, but if it's explained to them, then they say, yeah, okay, that's worthwhile. And then cheaper food, which benefits everybody. Cheaper simply because we have higher yields and greater efficiency in producing these grains. The illustration of the reduction in pesticide use, because this is probably the single most important issue that the anti-GMO people don't want to admit. Right? So we have the introduction of BT corn back in '96, and as that increases up to 2013, a corresponding reduction in the amount of insecticides used in the corn. It's hard to fight against this. It's easy to see this, but there are still people who say, yeah, but they're using other pesticides or they're using other herbicides, and it's increasing. It's kind of frustrating to deal with that, but nevertheless. Okay, getting around to our particular concern, public scientists, and I mean by that university scientists, also USDA ARS scientists, and then smaller companies that are trying to get into this system. We had early leadership in the USDA and the universities back in the 80s when the enabling technologies were first taking off. the public investment in research and development to breed improved crops using biotechnology. It was a very exciting time. There was lots of money coming in, and a lot of really good work was done, both in enabling technologies generally applicable to virtually all crops or foods, and also specific to certain crops. Just because you have a genetic engineering system that works on corn doesn't mean that same system will work on soybeans or peanuts or canola or whatever. In those early days, all of those enabling technologies had to be researched, doing the experiments in laboratories and small field, greenhouse and so on, and a lot of that work occurred in public universities and in USDA labs and small companies. USDA was the second largest developer of genetically engineered regulated crops going to field trials in those early days. Right. If you look at the records of the regulated trials for which scientists were taking stuff out to the field to see how it worked, USDA was number 2. And then hundreds of different crops, right? All we hear about is corn, soybean, cotton, canola maybe, but a wide range of genetically engineered small market crops were genetically engineered with various traits, a wide range of traits. It's not just herbicide tolerance, it's not just the Bt insect control. Enhanced nutritional composition, higher yields, water use efficiency, which I think is going to be very dramatic worldwide in the future, removal of allergens, disease resistance, and I put the citrus in there because that's, in California, our entire citrus industry is under threat by Wanglongbing, which is finished ravaging Florida and now moving to Texas and California. And the National Academy issued a report a couple of years ago saying our best tool to fight Wanglongbing is genetic engineering. Nothing else in the toolbox seems to work. We can delay the onset or delay the onset of the symptoms, but once a tree gets Wanglongbing, that's, its days are numbered. So, we put a lot of public money into this research and development. Where are the returns? Right? Very sparse, very sparse. Few genetically engineered crops coming out of public institutions, including USDA, have ever been commercialized. Right? Aren't they on the market? We've had this discussion in our community for years, and it was always a question, is it because they're unsafe? Is it because we can't use the intellectual property, the enabling technologies? Or is it because of regulations or some combination of all three of those? And the answer that we have now really is that it's the unnecessary regulatory barriers. I emphasize the unnecessary because, as I say, we are going to need regulations to deal with the true risks and the true hazards coming from those. The unnecessary regulations are the scariest thing that is now deterring public breeders and small companies from investing in the technologies. We do have a small group of amateur but interested people called the Specialty Crop Regulatory Assistants. We've had a number of workshops here in DC over the past, 10 years or so, getting some money from the Secretary of the USDA to help with this, to illustrate what our regulatory system is, how it does work, and to provide some encouragement for some of these small university and small company breeders to put their stuff in there and work with the system, because, as I mentioned earlier, it does actually work, and get some things through. So we, Specialty Crop Regulatory Assistance, as I say, it's a very small operation. We do have another workshop coming up next year, or later this year, and we will teach more people, more of these breeders, how to use the U.S. system, how to do it appropriately to navigate through and hopefully get their product on the market. The Arctic apple was one of the things that SCRA provided some advice for, and Also to show what the obstacles are and how we might be able to get around those obstacles, work within the system, and to complete the regulatory compliance. Again, so that we hope to get more of these products through. So as it stands, we only have, what, 3 or 4 genetically engineered crops events going through and getting approval from our agencies prior to commercialization. And some of those aren't even commercialized. What do breeders need to do to get a new plant variety or cultivar on the market? They need to have an agronomic performance test that to make sure that, you know, if they have a raspberry with a disease resistant, their new raspberry cultivar is actually resistant to that disease. And they have to make sure that it still yields as well as standard check varieties in that particular crop. And there's no penalty. Farmers don't like having to pay a yield penalty or a quality penalty to get some other desirable trait like a disease resistance. So these are non-starters. Do the proximate analysis, compositional, nutritional analysis, just, you know, see what are the vitamins and minerals, the ash content and so on. If there's any anti-nutritive factors, most of our crops have these things. They're endogenous. Humans didn't put them there. Mother Nature put them there. Blame her. We have to recognize that they are there and deal with them, and make sure that when in our breeding that we haven't inadvertently increased the quantities from the background. Distinct, uniform, and genetically stable, again, a standard to get the certificate. And that's it for conventional varieties. If they're genetically engineered and they trigger regulations, then you see a few other things that have to be investigated. Now, not all of these will be done for each one, but most of them probably. The ones that are necessary to increase confidence in the safety assessment for a regulator to come to the conclusion that, yes, this product is as safe as other crops of this species that are currently on the market, it's a different question. And to illustrate what the dossier looks like, you know, the 12 to 15 page dossier for a conventional cultivar and the stack of documents that was used to support the safety determination of a genetically engineered variety in both cases. And I'll disclose that this came out of my own labs. It's a picture I took for genetically engineered flax, and that was 20 years ago. The stack would be somewhat higher now, but the stack even then really did not increase confidence that the product was as safe as other flax on the market. Are they safe? This is the big question that consumers have. And the scientific studies show overwhelmingly the safety of genetically engineered products. Over 1,700 technical peer-reviewed articles looking at different aspects of safety. The few studies that have been published that show there is some hazard, all of them have been rejected in the scientific and medical community. Some of them are just bad science. Some of them are marketing sheets or politically agenda-driven that happen to get through, been retracted in some cases and not in others. Nevertheless, I think the reassurance from our National Academy of Sciences and others is that we've seen no adverse health effects attributable to genetically engineered crops. This is the cover from the National Academy report coming out in 2004 on the safety of genetically engineered foods, and I will disclose it out with this panel. Very quickly, the findings there: genetic engineering is not hazardous. The risks are similar. You've heard this before earlier today, and there are no documented adverse health effects. There are plenty of allegations of harm. None of them have been documented, and that's fortunately still true as of today. More recently, a subsequent study from the Academy on GE crops. Now that we've had history, right? Most of our regulations were developed when we had no familiarity, right? It was back in the 80s, late 80s, early 90s. And the crops only came onto the market grown by farmers in, what, 95, 96. So the regulations were in place at that time based on no familiarity. Now we have familiarity, right? There's no impact on health and safety. Farmers of genetically engineered crops are using less pesticide. The misuse of herbicide-tolerant crops can spur weeds with resistance, but This is similar to non-genetically engineered crops that are also herbicide tolerant, and all crops are tolerant to some herbicides. Humans didn't necessarily give them that trait. Again, Mother Nature, in her wisdom, gave all crops the ability to withstand some herbicides. And the recommendation, once again, regulate the product, not the process of genetic engineering. Now, if you ask a scientific society, are these things safe? None of them are going to say yes, because that implies an absolute safety. So it's always going to be relatively safe, or we'll compare the benefits and the risks and come down that, yes, the benefits outweigh the risks, or they may come down on the other side saying the risks outweigh the benefits. So if we take a look at some of the scientific societies that have studied genetically engineered crops and foods and issued a peer-reviewed report coming down on one side or the other, the ones that are generally positive, that say the crops and foods are the benefits outweigh the risks, include the national academies, the Institute of Medicine, the American Medical Association, and it's not just American institutions, the British Royal Society, Royal Society of Medicine, the European Food Safety Authority, the European Economic Commission, oddly enough, World Health Organization, the AAAS, International Seed Foundation, and dozens of others. Now, if we go to the other side of the ledger and say which professional, scientific, or medical societies conducted a similar study and came to the conclusion that the risks outweigh the benefits, then we find crickets. Not a single scientific society anywhere in the world has issued a statement that the risks of genetic engineering outweigh the benefits. Okay, getting back to our business with public universities and small companies, some of the plants, I just pulled these out of the database, and there are hundreds in the database. Things like, the traditional iconic chestnut and American elm, disease resistant, developed at SUNY Syracuse, right? Stuck in limbo. Would we like to see those out? I mean, obviously we do have to do some due diligence in ensuring they're not going to have problems in the environment, but how long have they been around? Tomatoes with disease resistance coming out of Florida and UC Davis, potato, improved quality from Wisconsin-Madison, canola, drought-tolerant canola from a small company, Performance Plants, citrus with HLB resistance in field trials. Here we have both a small operation, Southern Gardens with Texas A&M, and peanuts with allergens removed, again, a small company. So just a selection of the broad diversity of things, innovative products that may or may not work in the market, but we may or may not ever find out because they may or may not ever get to the market. And literally hundreds of other examples. So how do we overcome these unnecessary regulations? We regulate to assure safety of the products, right? Require only those tests that will allow the regulator to come to a determination that, yes, this product is as safe as equivalent products that are already out there. Or alternatively, to say, well, there may be more risk, but we have a management system to allow society to take advantage of the benefits and minimizing the risks. We should trigger regulation on the product, not the process. And I know the agencies will say that, well, we're not triggered by process. Maybe we were in the past, but we always look at the product. And that's true to an extent in that it is the product that is analyzed, but it's only the products that have come through the process of genetic engineering that get captured into the regulatory procedures. Focus on the identified risks. If you have a concern that a new protein, maybe that drought tolerance gene that we got from the desert plant, we put it into corn. Well, we want to make sure that the protein resulting from that gene is not allergenic, right? It conceivably could be. It has happened in the laboratory in the past. So that's a legitimate question, and the developers of that drought-tolerant corn should be prepared to answer that question. How do you know that this protein isn't allergenic? Familiarity. How many BT corn varieties have been approved? There are dozens. I can understand why the first one would raise issues. We want to know, is this safe to grow? Is it safe for the environment? And the effects on non-target organisms. Those are all legitimate questions. But why do we have to ask the same questions for the 17th BT corn variety? We should be looking at, this is corn, it has this trait in it, BT, providing the insect control. Is there anything different about this number 17 than the number 1, or the number 2, or the number 3? And if there isn't, we shouldn't have to put those products through the same regulatory machinery as number 1 and 2 and 3. So what we're suggesting is that and we're certainly not the first to suggest this, recognizing that there should be a tiered approach. Things with low risk should get a low bar for regulatory scrutiny. Things of high risk, maybe the first time you see a given trait and the first time you see a particular type of crop. Snapdragons, right? We're going to put some unusual trait into snapdragons. We've never reviewed snapdragons before. There's going to be some questions. We're going to turn snapdragons into a weed. Really unlikely, but maybe that's at least a fair question to ask the developers. And why would they do that with snapdragons anyway? Other things, BT corn it should be a pretty low bar. We have a lot of familiarity and experience. We know what BT does to corn. And these options also protect traditional breeding, because sometimes we hear traditional breeders say, wait. I like the way that you're only doing genetically engineered crops. I don't want you coming after me with my ionizing radiation mutagenesis, scrambling the DNA and putting God knows what substances into the foods, right? We've never been regulated, and we don't want to be regulated. And quite appropriately, they don't need to be regulated, because we've never had a problem with that. Conclusion. Public, academic, and small businesses have developed hundreds of potentially useful genetically engineered crops. Only a handful have made it to the market. Only one, I think, has had any real impact, and that is the papaya in Hawaii. The regulatory requirements unrelated to safety are the main obstacle. And unrelated, I include there things that are irrelevant entirely, and also things that they could actually be safety types of questions. But we've already answered that question. The additional data in answering this question will not increase the confidence in the determination that this product is as safe as something already out there. If we don't do this until the regulations change, not only we scientists, but farmers, consumers, and the environment will continue to be denied those potential benefits. The current regulatory policy discourages innovation. So when we consider things like the very exciting gene editing, new breeding technologies coming through, my colleagues, academic colleagues, are saying, if we're going to be regulated, we're not even going to bother start doing the experiments, because we're just not going to get stuff through regulation. Even with traditional transgenics, right? It's not an oxymoron. People say, I got this really exciting idea to put this trait into this crop, and I can get the money to do the technology and field trials and so on, but nobody's willing to give me the money to actually cover the regulatory compliance costs. So we've lost that. That game is over. Are we going to do the same thing with gene editing and more modern versions of transgenic work? Thank you very much for your attention.
We have a little time. I guess I would open the floor for any of you that want to question Dr. McHughen on any of the findings or presentation.
I'm Sally Rock. I'm the Executive Director of the Foundation for Food and Ag Research. I was wondering about with gene editing, what if you had your crystal ball, where do you see it going as far as the regulatory framework for it?
Well, we have the opportunity. We've been talking about changing the regulations, or tinkering at least with regulations from the very beginning. Now we kind of have to, because we're seeing products of gene editing coming through that aren't being regulated at all. And I mean, if you're the developer of the product, you think that's terrific. If you have a responsibility to the public to make sure we're not releasing things that may have some hazards, you don't necessarily think it's that terrific. So we have the opportunity with this technology now to go back to the drawing board and say, okay, this time let's do it right so that, you know, we're not stifling innovation, that we do actually address the safety issues with all of these things, not gene editing as a process, not recombinant DNA as a process, but what is the trait and the species, the combination of those two things, what could be wrong with that, or what are we not seeing that we perhaps should be seeing? So I'm excited at that prospect, right? I mean, it is a very exciting set of technologies, but they're tools. The same as genetic engineering is a tool. Let's not worry about the tool. Let's worry about what we can do with that tool, the final product. And that is the thing that will not only provide the benefits, but also provide the hazards, potentially. Sir?
I'll keep Matthew for a while, right? You know, it's interesting when you look at it from the standpoint that scientists have been very successful in terms of developing these products and also demonstrating their safety. However, the opponents have been even more successful in generating opposition to
Sure.
and concerns about it. And you're, as pointed out in the paper with the Pew Organization study, showed that the greatest disparity between scientists and the general public on a scientific issue is with respect to the safety of GE products. So the question I have is, how do you turn that around? Because at the end of the other thing I want to point out, as was also pointed out in the paper, the biggest segment in food products now is non-GMO verified. So how do you turn that around?
Well, I'm not sure that we can. I mean, as academics, it's typically not our job to promote any particular products or even technologies. We are educators. We can provide you with information. And we do have ethical standards, as you do, but the people who are opposed don't. So they can post pictures of tomatoes with fetuses growing in them, saying this is what a GMO is. We can't counter that. We can't play that same game to fight them at that same kind of level. We have to be honest and ethical and say, you know, this is what GE actually is. It's a sweet potato, not a tomato with a fetus in it. And these are the benefits and these are the risks, and it is up to you as a consumer to weigh those benefits and risks and see whether that's appropriate for you to purchase a product or not. So, you know, we're fighting with one hand tied behind our back to begin with. And even if we weren't, it's not really our job to provide more than information and encouragement to, you know, dig deeper into your own opinions.
Yeah, just to follow up. So, you know, you've been involved in this area for many, many years. The question actually was more in general. It's not so much with respect to scientists, but with respect to society. So do you have any thoughts or ideas in terms of how society can kind of, you know, scientists being a part of that effort, obviously, but how can society maybe try to, you know, turn that?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, thanks. Good question. I am enthusiastic. Consumers have long said, you know, there's nothing in it for us, right? You're helping the farmer, you're helping these big seed companies, chemical companies, but what's in it for us? And they don't see the benefits. I'm hopeful that things like the Arctic apple will take off, that, you know, people will, you know, send their kids to school with apple slices rather than a Twinkie, and they will see a benefit to that. Similarly with the potato, and hopefully some of these other products will come through, and at the same time that they see direct benefits to themselves, their own families, you know, we're trying to drill it into them that none of these horror stories that you've heard about for the last 20, 30 years have come true, right? This is a safe technology. The products that are getting on the market are safe. We've never seen a problem documented. So get that point across that these things are safe. These products, you can choose to use them or not, but don't hesitate. If you see a product you like and it happens to be a GMO, you know, go for it. And I think some of the products that are coming through are addressing that direct consumer appeal much more so than a BT corn. I mean, the consumers of BT corn seed are the farmers, right? Over 90% of them are growing it. So that product is very appealing to the consumers of that particular product. We don't have an equivalent for ordinary non-farming consumers. I'm hoping to see those.
I didn't want to occupy time, but I was in that same vein. I think some of the things that have been happening, which I don't want to say pit groups against each other, but sort of the groups that have been together on anti-GMO sometimes separate when things happen, such as the hornless cow, where you have the animal welfare people are in favor of it,
Right.
and those that are against GMOs. Or if you saw Michael Eisen last week, who was with Impossible Foods, he was talking about how GMOs have basically saved the world, but in their case of Impossible Foods, which is a plant-derived meat substitute, which uses heme as a substitute, and the heme is produced through genetically modified yeast, which gives the food the flavorful taste like meat that comes from animals. That is an example of a product whereby you are health conscious because you want to eat a plant-based meat, but you then are eating what is derived from a GMO. Again, it's not a GMO itself, but the heme product is derived from a genetically modified organism. And I wonder how that will play out again both in the regulatory framework, but just in public acceptance of the food GMOs in agriculture.
Right. Sure. The more products that come out that will appeal to at least some segment of the community, the wider community, I think will help, as long as they do actually do what they're supposed to do and are safe. So with that provision in there. But one of the most effective ones that I often start with, as I did today, is human insulin. Right? I don't like the idea. People say, I don't like the idea of this, going against Mother Nature's species barrier. Yet, if you're diabetic and you're taking insulin, you have no qualms about that. There's never been any organized opposition, at least not since it came out, to insulin. And not only is it crossing the species barrier, it comes from we humans, supposedly at the pinnacle, going into lowly microbes. Right? I mean, is that a violation of some ethical standard? Not if you're diabetic. Other comments? Questions? Chris?
Yeah, I'll just toss a question out there. I think we've actually discussed this before. You talk about, regulating the product on the process, and I think we've all heard that enough. We kind of get that. But I guess on the other side of that, where you're also saying that regulation of products is really warranted in some cases and necessary both for public confidence but also to ensure safety of the product. If you were to regulate just the product and ignore the process, would you then have to rely on self-certification that a product is risky enough that a person has to come into a regulatory agency? The reason I ask this is when I was running some grant proposal programs for USDA, we would look at about 150 proposals every year in both food safety and in biotech risk assessment. And one of the pages that's up front is what we call the NEPA page. And you had to certify, either your product in your proposal was going to have no impact on the environment, or you fit under a categorical exclusion, which, by the way, the attorneys told me it was really shaky ground. And not any of those proposals over the course of 4 years did any scientist ever indicate that their proposal might have some impact, therefore needed to be regulated. So with that in mind, I guess I'm wondering what you would propose to get around that idea of focusing on the process.
I think what we discussed in our team was having the features, and it's not just our team, but you've heard this before as well. If it's a new combination of a species with a trait, and the combination of the trait with the species, right? I mean, even if it's something like, BT, we know what BT is like in corn. If we put BT into cowpeas, right? Cowpeas have never had BT before. That's a new product, regardless of how we might do it. right? We could do gene editing, right? I mean, one of the beauties of gene editing is you can go into a genome and find something that's homologous to a BT. Doesn't matter how distant it may be, but you can tinker one base at a time and end up producing, BT protein from, some innocuous benign gene from that cowpea using gene editing. And the question I think we in the scientific community, regulated community would be, yeah, I think the first one of those, we would want somebody else to look at that and ask questions that we might not think of asking ourselves. How you do that mechanistically, we did not prescribe any of that level of detail, but conceptually, the first time someone sees a BT gene or BT protein in a cowpea equivalent, that should be investigated, fairly stringently, simply because there's no familiarity, or for no other reason that there's no familiarity. The second and subsequent ones, they go from the high bar down to the low bar, and perhaps no bar at all eventually. But we would hesitate to tell you guys how to do your job.
Following up on Chris's comment and actually your response, it sounds like if it's a new crop and the combination, then that bar is way up here, and I'm not sure how that helps small businesses and universities get through it, because anytime you do anything new, it's got a high bar, and it's that high bar that the universities and small businesses can't leap over. So how do you address that?
That's how high is the bar? The bar should be as high as required for the regulatory community to be satisfied on the safety. All right. Once you get to the level where you as a regulator can say, I now have enough data about this new crop that I'm confident that our farmers can grow it, and it's not going to become a weed of agriculture. Our consumers, our animals can eat it, and it's not going to give them cancer or tumors. And that's where the bar should stop. If they're not convinced of that, then the bar has to go higher. You need to convince we have a concern that, maybe this introduced plant will have invasiveness characteristics in the American climate and environment that it doesn't have in its home country. Provide information to address that concern. I don't think any scientist would be particularly objecting to legitimate questions like that. At the same time, it is actually something that I'm speaking personally here because we didn't discuss it in the group, but that's something that we should be asking, right? I mean, the most damage that we've done to our environment is introductions from other countries where, benign plants there, they come here and they're invasive. That's far more damaging to our society than yet another BT event. So maybe we should be capturing those so-called simple introductions that we have never done before, even though they're not genetically engineered. I mean, does that make sense? Does that answer your concern?
It may make sense, but I don't think it answers how a small business or an academic are going to actually get through the system and be able to get funding to do the types of studies that.
Well, okay, let me, just my own thought experiment here. If I have an idea that there's some, plant in Australia that would be really cool to grow in California, and I want to bring it in, my own due diligence would be addressing, I think, many of the same concerns that a regulator should be asking me later on. So whether I'm going to genetically engineer it or gene edit it or do nothing at all, just bring it in and see how it grows, we have had problems with those types of introductions in the past. And as a scientist, hopefully I would, be responsible enough to do that due diligence and make sure that I'm not bringing in something that, at least prima facie, is going to become a weed of agriculture and invasive of our environments. So I would have to think to myself, okay, before I go to Australia and collect samples or seeds or cuttings, what do I think is going to happen? What do I think is going to happen? And is there a way I can test that, in a laboratory and greenhouse before we actually put it out in the field? So, that's stepwise progression, and it's almost like the tiered approach. You do it step by step, and as long as the answer is, so far so good, then that's great. As soon as you hit the bar and say, we may have a problem with this, then it's over. But that's, we have dealt with that as well. It's not new.
So you have briefings tomorrow on Capitol Hill.
Yes.
Let me suggest to you that I think what's going to be necessary for the outcome that you're looking for is actually going to be legislative action, because you're not going to get the kind of regulatory change that you're advocating for through the agencies. The agencies are bound by statute, and they're going to be, they continue to operate on the basis of the statute. I speak with someone who was at EPA for 17 years, so to make those kinds of changes, they have to come through statute. And a perfect example would be one that, again, was raised in the paper, the honey sweet plum, whereby the regulations require, if you're a nursery and you take on this budwood in order to graft onto your plants to try to make plum pox virus-resistant plums, you have to register as a pesticide producing establishment. Nurseries didn't want to do that. But that's
No, yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, no, I appreciate that.
But that's a function of the regulation.
Right.
So EPA cannot tell a nursery, well, you don't have to do that because it's a function of the regulation.
Well, thank you, Alan. Thanks for
Thank you.
being here. Thanks for the input of how to position this with the audience that we'll be speaking to tomorrow. We do have kind of a small reception set up aside. We've got some wine and some water, some coffee and some cheese and fruit and some other things. So if you'd like to stay around for a few minutes and visit with Alan, myself, or anybody else, please do so. We invite you to join us. And again, thanks for coming today and thanks for being a part of this program. Thank you. And Wendy, thanks for you and APL for allowing us to use the place to hold. Thanks.
I think this is,
There are some extra copies of the paper available. If you want to take a copy along and share with a colleague, please pick up a copy on the way out, and also the quick catch sheets.